Let me move on to looking at the ethics. So firstly, as I said, it's important for any ethical appraisal of animals to recognise that animals can suffer. So you might say, well, how do we know that? If you really want to be sceptical, if you want to think of that Descartes might not have been completely mistaken. So how do we know? Well, they have anatomy and physiology rather like us, so they have nervous systems rather like us, particularly if we're talking here about vertebrates. It seems like they have nervous systems that are organised like ours. They behave as if they're in pain in appropriate circumstances. So if your dog is lying in the way asleep and you tread on your dog's tail, your dog yelps and runs around maybe a little bit in much the same way as if somebody had trod on your hand while you were lying down, you might have behaved. We see the parallels, and as we know, we share the evolutionary history. So if the anatomy is similar, the behaviour is similar, we don't, and we have a similar origin, it seems more parsimonious to believe that the same mechanism is working in both of us, rather than two separate mechanisms. So I think that's very briefly why we can have reason to believe that animals are conscious beings and can suffer, that is, that they have mental states. But it's a more difficult question to ask, well, does this apply to all animals? I just referred a moment ago to vertebrates. So you could grade animals in evolutionary terms, roughly according to their distance from us. And then you might say, well, some of the things that I mentioned, for example, the similarities of anatomy and physiology, are much closer when we're talking about animals and birds than if we're talking about mollusks or crustacea or insects. So maybe the parallels aren't so good. And with some of these, of course, right down the bottom of this list, there doesn't seem to be the behavioural parallel as well, and the evolutionary distance is vastly greater. So I think we have to accept that, and we have to accept that we don't really know which beings along these lines are conscious or capable of suffering, but that we can be highly confident of the beings at the top of the list. We can be highly confident that mammals and birds are conscious beings, that there are, if you like, subjective states, that there's something of what it's like to be a dog or what it's like to be a cat, which people who have lived with those animals get some sense of, perhaps, even if they don't know precisely. I'd argue that the same is true about vertebrates in general, but there has been some debate about whether fish do suffer as we do because their brains are differently organised. So I'd say, okay, there's a little bit of doubt about fish. I think not enough to say that we shouldn't be concerned about the likelihood of causing suffering to fish, but I'd say it's less certain than with birds and mammals. Now, if you get to invertebrates, again, the certainty drops with the possible exception here of the octopus, which seems to be the most highly intelligent mollusk as far as we know. If you want to check up on that, go onto YouTube and Google something like octopus tricks or something of that sort. They're actually quite amazing at learning new tricks. In one of the videos, an octopus is given a glass jar with a screw-top lid that has in it something that the octopus normally eats. So it takes the octopus about a minute to work out how to get the lid off a screw-top jar, something that presumably it's never seen before and obviously did not evolve to deal with screw-top jars. So seems to be capable of learning and hard to believe that it's not conscious. But with other invertebrates, much harder to know. With Crustacea, again, there's room for doubt. Crustacea don't have a centralized nervous system to the same extent that we do. They have localized ganglia or nerves which control separate limbs in some cases. So it's a bit hard to imagine exactly what's going on. Are they feeling pain in various places rather than in one central state of consciousness? I think we just don't know. So you might feel there's more room for doubt. And the same may be true of insects. Insects behave in some ways that seem remarkably well adapted, and they seem to be able to do complicated things, but they also do them in rather robotic kind of ways. An example of this is ants that live in colonies remove any dead ants from the colony. So they don't want dead ants inside. So if an ant dies, some of the worker ants take the dead ant and carry it out. It's like sort of cleaning your home. You don't want dead things lying around your home. Okay, but it turns out that there is just one thing that triggers this reaction, and this is a particular chemical that ants emit when they die. And if you get this chemical and you put it on a living ant, the worker ants will pick up the living ant and carry it out exactly as if it were a dead ant, even though it's wriggling while they do it. So they don't seem to recognize this, and this suggests maybe it's maybe it makes sense to think of them as clever little robots, well programmed by evolution for survival. So I just don't know. I think you have to be agnostic here. And if you get down to bivalves like clams and oysters, which not only don't have the same kind of anything like a centralized nervous system, but also don't have the capacity to run away from sources of danger, which is presumably one of the reasons we evolved a sense of pain, perhaps more reasonable to think that they don't feel pain, that they're not capable of suffering. So it's a scale that runs down from, I would say, very high level of confidence to very low level of confidence, or very high level of doubt, if you want to put it like that. And you have to decide along the way how much of the balance of the doubt you ought to give to the creature, and that may depend on the circumstances and what reasons you might have for doing something to it which would cause it to suffer if it is capable of suffering. So those are two important preliminaries. And then let's get to the ethics of how we then ought to treat beings. And mostly, let's say, just for convenience, I will focus on the vertebrates and particularly the mammals and birds, as they're the ones which we, in some ways, are mostly interacting with, and obviously where the capacities for suffer are clearest. So this is what we could characterize as the mainstream view today, the kindness-cruelty view, if you like. I think that expression comes from the philosopher Tom Regan. So we have duties to be kind to them and to avoid being cruel to them, and that's why we think that cruelty ought to be prohibited. And if you see somebody, for example, kicking a dog, you think that that's wrong, and if they do it repeatedly, they could even be prosecuted for it. Or if somebody has a horse tied up in a field with nothing to eat and the horse is starving, that's cruelty, and people ought to be prosecuted for that. But this is, as these examples suggest, deliberate or wanton cruelty that we typically prosecute. And the mainstream view, I think, suggests that animal interests can be overridden by our own interests, for example, in feeding and clothing ourselves. So the major animal industries to provide food and leather or wool for ourselves. So that mainstream view, at least in English-speaking countries, condemns this sort of activity as cruelty. Because we feel it's in some way it's not serving an important interest of ours, like feeding or clothing ourselves, something of that sort. It's a sport, a game, and we don't like to see animals made to suffer in sport, even though this gives pleasure to tens of thousands of spectators gathering to watch a bullfight. But, as I say, at least in this country, most people think that this is wrong. An even more graphic example is this. This is, I don't know whether you remember this a few years ago, I guess, and most of you were a lot younger. This is Michael Vick, a well-known football player who was found to be also engaging in dogfighting, running a dogfighting ring, and was charged with cruelty over it. And when this happened, there was just an overwhelming wave of fury and you could say hatred against Michael Vick. Michael Vick was convicted. He served time in jail, I think maybe roughly 18 months or something like that. And after he'd been released, he sought to resume his career. And he was, because of his abilities, he was sought after by the Philadelphia football team. And a lot of Philadelphia fans protested about this too, even though he'd served time in jail and said that he was repentant about what he had done and actually was doing talks for the Humane Society of the United States, telling people that what he'd done was wrong and that we ought to respect animals and not treat them in this way. So he was trying to show his repentance. But still there were people who said that what he'd done was so horrible he should never play football again. So the reason I'm mentioning this is the contrast between the attitude we have towards suffering, undoubtedly suffering, that is inflicted to animals on animals in sport, as is dogfighting and as with the bullfighting example, and the other things that we allow. So here's one example. This is debeaking, or as it's now called, beak trimming of a young chick who is going to be then used for laying eggs. So it's absolutely standard for laying hens. If you buy eggs in this country, it's almost certain that they will have come from hens who had their beaks cut off like this. There may be a few free-range organic producers who actually rear their own chicks and don't get them like that, but even if they are organic, usually they're just buying chicks from large-scale breeders, and they will be just doing this automatically. Certainly any of the standard eggs sold in supermarkets that are not organic or free-range will have come from hens that were treated like this. It's interesting that the industry, when I started writing about this, it was a long time ago, of course now, back in the 1970s, you would just turn to any magazine of the egg industry talking about the need to debeak your hens. That was just the standard expression. But that was because nobody was criticising them for doing this at the time. Once the animal movement got going and started talking about this, they said, oh, it's not debeaking, it's beak trimming. We just take off the very tip of the beak. It's like trimming your fingernails. But in fact, it's nothing like trimming your fingernails because we don't actually use our nails to work out what's going on in the environment. We use our fingers for that, and they're sensitive. And hens use their beaks. If you watch a hen, obviously, they're pecking at the ground all the time, and they're sorting out what might I be able to eat and what might I not be able to eat of the things that I'm pecking at. So they have nerves in their beak. They have a lot of nerves in their beak. It's their primary way of relating to their environment. And what's happening here is that it's being cut off with a hot blade. No anaesthetic is being used. This is being done at great pace. You know, you seize one, you trim it or cut off its beak, you seize the next, and you let it go. So there's no doubt that this causes significant suffering to them, but it's a standard practice of a standard industry that we have today. And I have no doubt that in terms of the quantity of suffering, it causes overwhelmingly more suffering than is caused by dogfighting or many other activities that we find somewhat horrific. Question? Oh, sorry. Okay, that's another question about what's wrong with the problems about the way we treat animals, but we'll come to that in a later lecture. The birds are then confined, right? The standard way of keeping eggs for hens for egg production is you confine them in cages. That's more convenient, allows for more mechanisation, and allows therefore for far less labour. But if you confine birds together, some of them will be more aggressive than others. And in a normal farmyard situation, the less aggressive birds know which are the more aggressive birds, the dominant birds, and they get out of their way. It's called a pecking order. We all use that expression now, right? You get out of the way of the hens that are above you in the pecking order. And hens are quite good at learning who's above them in the pecking order and who's not. In a flock of, I think, up to 90 individuals, they can know with each one of them where their place in the pecking order is, whether they're above or below them. But you put them in a cage and they can't get away from each other. So if they have a sharp beak, the more aggressive birds are likely to kill the less aggressive birds. They'll start pecking at them, they'll draw blood, and once they draw blood, they start to get into a kind of cannibalistic frenzy quite often. So the producers don't want their birds killed, obviously, and if the beak is blunt, it's not going to draw blood, and the birds are not going to kill each other. They may still peck at each other a bit.
If one buys eggs in this supermarket and it says cage-free, does that mean they haven't been had their beaks clipped?
No. If you're buying eggs that say cage-free, they've probably still had their beaks clipped. Cage-free eggs are still kept in rather crowded conditions. They're, as I said, a flock of maybe 90 hens can know each other. Typical cage-free conditions, you may have 10,000 hens in a single shed. So there's still going to be problems with aggression. If you really want to get over that, you have to have a lot more space. And as I say, some free-range producers may do that and may be able not to debeak and not have aggressive hens. But I'd say most, just the fact that it says cage-free is not in itself enough.